It was just another ordinary lunchtime at St. James Elementary, the sound of chatter, the clattering of trays, and the ever-present hum of energy that filled the cafeteria. But in one far corner, something quietly unfolded that would change the life of a young girl and a billionaire CEO forever. The cafeteria at St. James Elementary was alive with the usual lunchtime chaos. The sounds of trays clattering, kids shouting, and laughter filled the room. The smell of pizza and baked chicken drifted through the air, mixing with the unmistakable scent of juice spilled on the floor. It was an ordinary scene, one that could easily fade into the background of another school day. But in one quiet corner, there was a girl whose lunch was anything but ordinary. Emma Collins, a 5-year-old with messy brown hair braided tightly behind her head, sat alone at the farthest table. She wore a faded yellow dress with a unicorn on it, a hand-me-down from her older sister. She was careful to pick a seat away from the bustling groups of kids, preferring to sit quietly on her own. It wasn't that she was shy, it was that she had learned long ago that blending in was safer than standing out. Her lunch, though, was impossible to blend in with. It consisted of a single slice of plain bread and a small bottle of water, the kind of water you could buy in bulk at any corner store. Emma stared at her meal, breaking the crust off her bread slowly with her small hands, chewing each bite carefully. The bread was dry, but she didn't mind. It wasn't the meal she focused on. It was the silence, the space it gave her to escape the noise around her. From across the room, a few curious glances landed on her. At a nearby table, a group of kids began to whisper, their eyes darting in her direction. Emma didn't need to hear their words to know what they were saying. She had been the subject of their teasing before. She took another slow bite of her bread, trying to ignore them, wishing she could shrink away into the table. "Look at Emma," one of the boys said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bread and water for lunch. Must be poor." Laughter followed. It was the same every day. The teasing never stopped, but Emma had learned that reacting only made it worse. She didn't cry, she didn't fight back, she simply kept her head down and ate in silence, wishing for the bell to ring and signal the end of lunch. It wasn't that she didn't care about what the other kids thought. She did, but her mother, Sarah, worked 2 jobs just to keep them afloat, one cleaning offices at night, and the other stocking shelves at the local grocery store. Sarah did her best, but there was never enough time or money for anything beyond the basics. Emma understood that even at her young age. On the rare days when her lunchbox had a treat, a slice of cheese or an apple, Emma felt like the luckiest girl in school. But today, it was just bread and water, and she knew how that looked to the others. The cafeteria supervisor walked by once, giving Emma a quick, sympathetic glance. She smiled, but there was nothing more to offer. Emma was used to this. She wasn't the only child with a humble lunch, but she was the one who seemed to be noticed most often. She finished the bread slowly, drinking from her water bottle, wishing for the laughter to stop. The room was buzzing with conversation, but Emma felt a weight on her chest that made everything around her seem distant. It was a familiar feeling, one she had carried for as long as she could remember. Being different in a room full of people was harder than anyone could understand, especially when you were just a kid trying to fit in. But what Emma didn't know, what none of the children in that crowded room could have guessed, was that today was going to be different. Today, something was going to happen, something that would change the course of her life forever. Jonathan Reed's morning was filled with the usual business grind, back-to-back meetings, phone calls, and the constant shuffle of emails demanding his attention. As the CEO of a successful tech company, his schedule was relentless, always moving at a fast pace. But today, he had something different on the agenda, a quick stop at a local elementary school to visit one of the many institutions his foundation supported. It wasn't a visit he had planned himself, it was one of the many charitable obligations that came with running a company of his size. Jonathan was used to these sorts of visits. Polite handshakes, a few photo ops, some speeches, and a quick tour. That was the usual routine. He didn't expect anything different today. His car pulled up in front of St. James Elementary. It was a modest building, the kind of school that didn't make waves. He followed the director into the school, offering pleasant nods and listening to the standard updates about the classrooms, the new play equipment, and the library corner. But as he walked down the hall, something caught his eye. At the far corner of the cafeteria, amidst the noise and chaos, sat a young girl. She was alone, hunched over a small table, her hands slowly picking apart a slice of bread. The cafeteria was buzzing with the usual sounds of kids trading snacks and laughing, but Emma Collins, the girl sitting quietly by herself, was different. She wasn't laughing or talking. She was entirely focused on her bread, her small body slightly curled inward, as though she were trying to make herself invisible. There was nothing particularly striking about her appearance. Her yellow dress was faded, and her braids looked slightly messy, but Jonathan couldn't help but notice the way she sat so still, so alone, in the corner of the bustling cafeteria. His steps slowed as he observed her. She wasn't upset, but there was something in her posture that told him she was used to being overlooked. He paused, caught by a feeling he hadn't expected. It was a memory that suddenly came rushing back. The feeling of being a child who didn't quite fit in, of sitting at a table with a lunch that didn't match anyone else's. It was a feeling Jonathan recognized instantly, a quiet loneliness that settled deep in the pit of his stomach. The school director continued to speak beside him, but Jonathan was no longer listening. His mind was focused on the girl in the corner. The room, the noise, the chatter, it all faded into the background. Without thinking, he began walking toward her, drawn by something deeper than routine. He reached the serving line, picking up a tray like any other child. It was an unusual move for someone like Jonathan, who was usually surrounded by assistants and staff in every room he entered. He picked a lunch, pasta, fruit, and milk, not because he was hungry, but because it would let him sit next to her without drawing too much attention. As he made his way toward her, the cafeteria grew quieter. Children stopped talking, some turned to watch, confused by the sight of the man in the suit walking toward the lone girl at the table. Jonathan barely noticed the curious glances. His focus remained on Emma, her small figure still bent over her bread, oblivious to the attention around her. He reached her table, sat down beside her, and set his tray down gently. She looked up, surprised, her blue eyes wide with uncertainty. Jonathan smiled softly and said, "Hi, mind if I sit here?" The words were simple, but they carried more weight than he expected. Emma hesitated, glancing at the table of kids who had been laughing at her moments before. They were still watching, but now their smiles had faded into confusion. Emma finally gave a small, unsure nod. Jonathan settled in, picking up his fork as if this were the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Jonathan started to eat, not rushing, letting the silence settle between them. The children who had been teasing Emma now watched in silence, their laughter gone, replaced by uncertainty. Jonathan wasn't sure why he was doing this, but sitting there, at that small table, it felt like the right thing to do. The world outside the cafeteria seemed distant now. He had no grand plan, no speeches to make. All he knew was that this moment, this small act of choosing to sit down next to Emma, was more important than anything else on his agenda that day. Jonathan sat down beside Emma, setting his tray on the table with a soft clink that cut through the quiet of the moment. His movements were casual, unhurried, as if this was just another lunch break. But Emma, clearly caught off guard, continued to stare at him with wide eyes, her small fingers frozen midair, holding a crumb of bread. The cafeteria around them hummed with distant voices, but it felt like a world away. She glanced over at the other children, the ones who had been laughing only moments ago, and Jonathan could feel the tension in the air. He didn't know what had made him sit down beside her. Maybe it was the silence that surrounded her, the way she seemed so disconnected from the loud, energetic world around her, or maybe it was the faint sense of recognition he felt, as if he had been her at one point in his own life. "Hi," Jonathan said softly, breaking the silence between them. His voice was gentle, almost as though he were speaking to someone much older. "Mind if I sit here?" Emma blinked, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to being noticed like this, let alone by someone who seemed so important. She had learned long ago to keep her head down and avoid attention, especially when it came to her lunch. She had expected to eat in silence, just as she always did, but now she wasn't sure what to do. For a long moment, she said nothing. Jonathan didn't push her for a response. Instead, he began to eat his meal, picking up a fork and cutting into his pasta as if everything were normal. The act itself seemed ordinary enough, but to Emma, it felt like an unspoken invitation. After a beat, she took another small bite of her bread, her gaze flickering from her plate to Jonathan and back again. "Did you know," Jonathan began, keeping his tone light, "that one time I grabbed a can of food without looking, and it turned out to be dog food?" He smiled as he spoke, his voice carrying a bit of humor, as though he were telling a story to an old friend. "I was in a rush that morning, and I didn't pay attention. When I opened it, I was horrified." Emma looked up at him, the smallest hint of curiosity beginning to spark in her eyes. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but she was still hesitant. She had heard stories from teachers before, but they were usually about lessons or rules, never about something as silly as someone eating dog food. "Did you eat it?" she asked in a small voice, the first words she'd spoken since he sat down. Jonathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, I didn't eat it, but I definitely didn't realize how much I took for granted until that day." Emma's eyes brightened a little, and she gave a small laugh, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Jonathan's heart lightened as he saw the shift. It was a small moment, but it mattered. As he continued to eat, he picked up a grape from his fruit cup and slid it across the table. "Here," he said, his tone casual. "Want one?" Emma hesitated, looking at the grape as though it might be something rare, something too good to be true. She glanced up at Jonathan, unsure if he was serious. "Go ahead," Jonathan encouraged gently, his smile warm. "It's just a grape." After another moment of hesitation, Emma reached out, her small fingers brushing the grape. She brought it to her mouth and popped it in, chewing carefully as if savoring it. Jonathan watched her with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He didn't expect a grand transformation, but there was something in the way she relaxed, just a little, that told him he had made a small difference. For the next few minutes, the conversation continued on simple topics. Jonathan didn't ask about her family or her struggles, not yet. Instead, he kept things light, talking about his favorite animals, asking her about hers, and listening as she opened up. Bit by bit, she told him about the swings at the playground and how she liked to see who could go the highest. She mentioned the story her teacher had read last week about a rabbit who went on an adventure and how she wished she could read it again. Her voice was still soft, but it wasn't as hesitant now. There was a quiet warmth in her words, a tiny spark of confidence. The other children had stopped watching, their attention now turned elsewhere. Jonathan didn't say anything to them. He didn't need to. His simple act of sitting with Emma, of sharing a meal, had already shifted something. The teasing that had once filled the cafeteria seemed distant, almost irrelevant now. The air around Emma, which had once been thick with judgment, seemed to lighten. Jonathan leaned back slightly, watching Emma as she continued to nibble at her bread. But now there was a small smile on her face. It wasn't much, but to him, it was everything. Jonathan continued to eat, his movements relaxed, not rushing. For a moment, it felt as though he and Emma were simply two people sharing lunch, nothing more, nothing less. The sound of children's laughter and chatter still echoed through the cafeteria, but it seemed muffled now, as if their world had become a little quieter, a little smaller. Emma continued to nibble at her bread, her fingers moving more confidently now, though she still stole occasional glances at Jonathan. She had never expected a man, let alone someone dressed in a crisp suit, to sit next to her. It felt strange, yet not uncomfortable. Something about the calm in Jonathan's presence made it easier for her to relax. Jonathan noticed the slight tension in her shoulders slowly begin to ease. He smiled softly, pleased with the progress. He had no intention of pressing her to talk, but he wanted her to feel at ease. So he kept the conversation light, guiding it in a direction where she could open up if she felt like it. "You know," he said, picking up his fork and gesturing with it, as though telling an old friend a secret, "when I was your age, I used to love drawing. I couldn't get enough of it. I'd fill my notebooks with all sorts of crazy doodles, mostly monsters and robots." Emma's eyes brightened, her gaze now more focused on him than her food. "Monsters?" she asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. "What did they look like?" Jonathan chuckled. "Oh, they were big and scary. I'd give them multiple eyes and sharp teeth. Some of them even had wings, like dragons. My favorite one was a monster that lived under my bed. He was purple, with 3 heads. I'd draw him again and again, never getting tired of it." Emma giggled at the idea of a 3-headed, purple monster. For a moment she seemed lighter, more like a typical child her age. The giggle was soft, but it was a start. Jonathan had hoped for that moment, for her to relax just a little bit, and he'd found a way in. "What about you?" Jonathan asked, leaning forward slightly. "Do you like to draw?" Emma's face flushed with a small smile. "I do. I draw flowers. Lots of them. I like drawing the petals, but my favorite part is drawing the stems and leaves. I make them curly, like vines." "That sounds beautiful," Jonathan said, his tone genuine. "I bet you're really good at it. Do you have a favorite flower?" She nodded. "I like daisies. They're simple, but pretty." Jonathan smiled. "I love daisies too. They remind me of the sun. You know, when I was a kid, I thought if I picked too many, I'd make the sun sad." Emma's smile grew, a little more confident now. "I don't think the sun would get sad," she said, her voice light and teasing for the first time. "It would just grow more flowers." Jonathan laughed, a low, warm sound. "You're right. The sun would just keep making more flowers. The conversation continued like this, simple and easy. Emma shared more about the swings at the playground and the books her teacher read, her voice growing steadier with each passing minute. Jonathan didn't push her to share more than she wanted, but he could see a change in her. She wasn't just the quiet girl in the corner anymore. She was a little girl with her own interests, her own world, and in that moment she wasn't alone. And for Jonathan, it was clear that this was a moment he would remember, not for the grand gestures or important decisions he made that day, but for the quiet connection with a child who had simply needed someone to sit beside her. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the cafeteria began to shift. The loud chatter, once surrounding Emma like an impenetrable wall, seemed to soften. It wasn't complete silence, but the sharpness of the teasing had faded. Some of the children who had been watching Emma from afar now looked away, their attention diverted by something else. Jonathan noticed this subtle change, a shift that spoke volumes. Emma had stopped looking over her shoulder every few seconds, waiting for another round of laughter. Instead, she had settled into the conversation with him, her shoulders no longer hunched, her gaze a little more direct, a little more at ease. Emma finished her bread, leaving the last small bite untouched. She picked up her water bottle, taking a slow sip, as she glanced at Jonathan, almost as if checking to see if he was still there, if he still cared. And in that moment, he realized how deeply small gestures could matter. It wasn't just about sharing a meal. It was about showing up, sitting beside someone, and offering them your time, your attention, without any expectation. Around them, the rest of the cafeteria slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The children who had been teasing Emma earlier were now distracted, talking among themselves. The change was subtle, but powerful. Jonathan hadn't needed to speak up, to stop the teasing, or reprimand anyone. His quiet act of sitting with Emma had done more than any words could have. It had shifted the energy of the room, and the weight of her isolation had lifted, even if just for a while. Emma didn't smile brightly or jump up to thank him. There were no dramatic moments, but there was a quiet shift in her demeanor, a slight lightening of the burden she had been carrying. She wasn't the girl with the sad, lonely lunch anymore. She was simply a child who had been seen, a child who had shared a moment of connection. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, noticing the silence that had fallen over them. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful, like two people sharing a quiet moment of understanding. And though he didn't realize it at the time, he had done something far more important than just sitting next to her. He had given Emma something more precious than food. He had given her a small but profound sense of belonging. As the lunch period drew to a close, the bell rang, signaling the end of the break. The children began gathering their things, some chattering excitedly, others lost in their own thoughts, heading back to class. Emma, too, stood up slowly, closing her container and leaving the last piece of bread untouched. Jonathan stood as well, taking his tray and moving toward the trash can, though his thoughts remained on the quiet girl at the table. Emma hesitated for a moment before glancing up at Jonathan, her gaze meeting his with a quiet, searching look. He smiled, giving a small nod of reassurance, but said nothing. Instead, he simply watched as she gathered her things, her movements slow and deliberate. There was a newfound confidence in the way she carried herself, and Jonathan couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. He had made a difference today, though it hadn't been in any way he had expected. As Emma walked toward her classmates, Jonathan turned to follow the school director, who had been waiting near the door. The tour was nearly over, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just the moment in the cafeteria, it was something deeper, the realization that he had been in the right place at the right time. After a few moments, he excused himself from the director, telling her he needed to make a quick call. He stepped out of the cafeteria, his mind still on Emma, on the way she had seemed so lost in that crowded room, and how she had looked up at him, not with fear or shame, but with a quiet curiosity. Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by a buzzing in his pocket. He pulled out his phone, briefly glancing at the screen. It was a message from his assistant. The foundation's next big project was waiting for his approval, but today, in this moment, it felt insignificant compared to the small girl with the sad lunch. He walked down the hallway toward the principal's office, his mind turning over the events of the past hour. There had been something about Emma that lingered in his mind, something that went beyond the initial compassion he felt for her. He thought about her mother, how she must have been working hard to make ends meet, and how Emma's quiet demeanor was a reflection of a life that wasn't easy. His company was known for charitable giving, for big donations to large causes, but what he had witnessed today wasn't about a grand gesture. It was about something simpler, the need for connection, for someone to recognize that Emma wasn't invisible. As he entered the principal's office, Jonathan made a decision. Without saying a word to anyone, he sat down at the desk and began to type an email to his assistant. It was brief, simple, but it would have a lasting impact. He instructed her to set up a meal support fund for the school. It would be enough to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, would have access to nutritious meals, not just on special occasions, but every day. The fund would cover meals for the next 3 years. Jonathan didn't want anyone to know he was behind it. He didn't want any recognition or applause. He simply wanted to know that, because of one small decision, to sit with a child who had been overlooked, things would be different for her, for all the children in that school. Weeks passed since Jonathan's visit to St. James Elementary, and though life continued with its usual rush, the memory of that day lingered with him. Every time he passed by a school or saw children on the street, he thought of Emma, the girl in the yellow dress with the bread and water lunch. He wondered how she was, if things had improved for her, or if the teasing had stopped. He didn't see her every day, of course, but he continued to follow the progress of the meal support fund. The foundation's donation had been finalized, and he made sure to keep it anonymous, letting the school handle the logistics without drawing attention to his involvement. It wasn't about recognition for him, it was about making sure no child would go hungry, no child would sit alone in a cafeteria, and no child would feel invisible. A few weeks later, Jonathan found himself back at St. James for another check-in on the school's progress. It wasn't part of his usual routine. He had scheduled the visit on a whim, wanting to see how things were going without the formalities. As he stepped through the school's doors, he noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The energy was lighter, the halls seemed brighter, the walls adorned with more artwork, more smiles. When he reached the cafeteria, he stopped just outside the door. The noise from inside was familiar, kids chatting, laughing, and eating, but there was something different now. Jonathan peered inside, his eyes scanning the room, until they landed on Emma. She was sitting at a table, but this time she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by a small group of children, all laughing and talking, completely at ease. Her smile was wide, her eyes bright, and her body language was open. She looked nothing like the girl who had sat alone, trying to shrink into herself just weeks before. The change was evident in the way she held herself, the way she engaged with her classmates. Jonathan couldn't help but smile as he watched her. This was the kind of transformation he had hoped for, though he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. He stepped inside the cafeteria, quietly making his way toward her table. As he approached, Emma spotted him, her eyes widening in recognition. She excused herself from her friends and stood up, walking over to Jonathan with a smile that made his heart swell. "Hi," she said brightly, the shyness from their first meeting now replaced with confidence. "It's good to see you again." Jonathan smiled, bending down slightly to her level. "It's good to see you too, Emma," he said. "How have you been?" "I've been good," she replied. "I made a new friend today. Her name's Lily, and I got to sit with my friends at lunch. No one laughs at me anymore." Jonathan's smile grew. In that moment, he realized that his small decision to sit with her that day had made more of an impact than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't about changing everything overnight. It was about giving her the space to grow, to feel seen, to feel like she belonged. As Emma returned to her table, Jonathan watched her with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. Weeks passed since Jonathan had seen Emma in the cafeteria. Despite his busy schedule, he often found himself thinking about her, how she was doing, if the change in her life was lasting, if she truly felt seen. But he didn't return to the school for several weeks. His visits quiet and unannounced. His mind kept returning to the simple gesture of sitting beside her and how it had shifted so much more than just the moment. One afternoon, Jonathan visited St. James Elementary once more, not for a checkup or to oversee a donation, but because he felt a strange pull to understand more about Emma and her situation. This time, he requested to speak to the school director. After hours, he wanted to know how Emma was really doing. The conversation started as he expected. The director spoke of Emma's improvement, of her blossoming confidence, and how she now ate lunch with friends instead of sitting alone. But then, the director paused, as if there was more to share, something Jonathan didn't expect to hear. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "Emma's mother, Susan, has had a rough go of it. You know she works 2 jobs, right?" Jonathan nodded. He had always suspected as much, but hearing it so plainly hit him in a way he hadn't prepared for. "Well, there's something you might not know," the director continued. Emma's aunt Laura was very close to your family. Jonathan froze. The name Laura echoed in his mind like a distant bell. His half-sister, it had been years since he'd thought of her. She and Susan had been close friends, but when Laura passed away, Susan had chosen to cut ties with Jonathan's side of the family. The weight of the revelation settled heavily in Jonathan's chest. Emma wasn't just a child he had helped out of pity, she was family. His niece, the director, saw the shock on Jonathan's face and continued. Susan never wanted to ask for help, especially not from your family. She kept Emma to herself, trying to make it on her own. But now, with Emma starting to open up more, it's clear that things are changing. Jonathan's mind was racing. Emma, sitting alone in that cafeteria just weeks ago, was his niece. The girl he had quietly sat with, shared a meal with, was connected to him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The realization was more profound than any charitable donation or public gesture. He left the school that evening with a deep sense of responsibility. He didn't know exactly what it meant yet, but he knew one thing: his involvement in Emma's life was not just about providing financial support. He was family now, and that meant being there for her in ways he hadn't expected. That evening, Jonathan sent a message to his assistant, not about business, but about something much more personal. He wanted to know about any local job openings that might be a good fit for Susan. It wasn't just about charity, it was about giving her the stability she deserved, without the stigma of a handout. He had begun to see Emma not as a project, but as someone he had a deep, unspoken bond with. She had reminded him of what it meant to be seen, truly seen, by someone who cared, not because of what they could give, but because they had decided to be there. Jonathan knew that from now on, he wasn't walking away from Emma. He wasn't just the stranger who had once shared lunch with her, he was her family, and that would never change.